In this video, I'm going to walk you through our last two examples. We're going to get some funny colors on the video, but don't be too concerned about that. I'm going to work through example 11 and example 12, where we're going to work with the concept of a residual plot. Now, just to save a little bit of time, please note what I've done. In my calculator, I have put the L1 and L2, my X and Y values, into my L1 and L2 from example 11. And for example 12 that you're going to work your way through, I've already gone ahead and put them into my L4 and my L5. So let's go ahead and just follow through the rest of this example. We'll work through the mechanics on the calculator one more time. Hopefully you'll be very comfortable with that and understand the concepts, all of the calculator concepts that we've built. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and rerun my regression model. We'll see these numbers come back, but let's go ahead and do such. So stat, calc, choose option 8, linreg A plus BX. I have L1, L2, frequency list clear. I'm going to go ahead and store the regression equation in my Y1. I do so by hitting vars, choosing Y vars, choosing option 1, the function. I get my list of Y's that I can take, and now I've got my Y1 to populate. And now I can go ahead and calculate my regression line. Everything comes back. I do have, by the way, pretty good coefficient, my R value, 0.876, looking like a pretty strong correlation in the positive direction. Now, a couple other things that I asked you to do. We're going to move our residuals into L3 just so we can see them. To do that, stat, get your lists, move yourself over to L3, and get up into the area where instead of you're trying to enter individual cells, you have the name highlighted. You now can go over here and populate L3 by doing second, list, and take an option 7, your res ID. And so all my residuals will populate in. Oops, my fault. Let me clear that. I hit the wrong key. Second, stat, res ID, enter. And now I populate it. Sorry about that. I can see all my residuals. Now, a couple other things I asked you to do. Run one var stats on the residuals. Let's do it on L3 real quick. Stat, calc, one var stats, L1, and here we go. As before, what did we notice? We're going to see, oh, excuse me, not one var, I need to do one var stats on L3. I apologize. Sorry about that. My residuals are living in L3. So here we go with that. Stat, calc, one var stats. Let's call it L3 this time because that's the one that you really want. What do I notice? My X bar, 3.58 to the e to the negative 11th. We're definitely sitting very, very close to 0. We'll talk sum of squared residuals. We can see there we have actually minimized that. Looks like a pretty big value, but that's what the regression line's done. It has minimized our squares of the residuals. So now there's a couple other things to do in the calculator. So let's do those. Number 1, take a look at what's in your Y1 now. Oops, sorry. Your Y1 has our regression equation. 201.16 plus 24.02x. Can I generate a residual plot? Sure. Let's look at a couple other things real quick. Let's see what our plot is showing right now. My plot has L1, L2. I should get a nice scatter diagram. And by the way, I'm going to get the regression line showing up as well. I'm going to hit the graph button. We'll see whether or not I have my window set properly in a second. Looks like I already did. So I already had zoom stat. And so as a result, I can not only see my scatter plot, but I can also see the regression line. We talked before in class, if I went ahead and rotated this until I was staring at this as a vertical horizontal line, we won't do it here with the calculator just because of the camera angle or whatever, but if we had rotated and made it flat, I'm actually seeing the residual plot. But let's do it in a little bit different way on the calculator to make sure that we can really see this. What we're trying to see is this a suitable model? Is a linear model appropriate for these points that we have? And what we're hoping is that the linear model has accounted for all the pattern in the data points. If we've accounted for all the pattern, then what's left over should just be a bunch of random stuff, for lack of a better term. In other words, we should see some points kind of out there, scattered randomly with a little bit of symmetry, but not with any type of discernible pattern. And so let's see if we can do that. And here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go back. I'm going to now do second plot. I have my plot on, but I'm going to make a change. Instead of plotting L1 and L2, I'm going to plot L1 and my residuals. So take a look. L1. Now I'm going to change. My Y list is going to be my residuals, L3. I'll run, and here we go. Now when I go ahead and set graph, still have my regression line, which I think I'm going to get rid of in a second. I'll explain why in a moment. And I have a lot of scale there. So let's go over. I'm going to kill my Y1 just for a moment. Sorry, Y1. You served me well, but I'm done with you. Go back to my graph, and I'm going to see absolutely nothing now. I don't see a residual plot. Why? Zoom stat again. Zoom. Option 9, zoom stat. And there comes my residual plot. Look at that compared to the good old line y equals 0. What do I notice? Do I see any pattern here? No. Do I see a decent amount of points above positive residuals, decent amount of negative residuals? The answer is yes. There's no discernible pattern here. And what's that telling me? What's the residual plot telling me? It's telling me that a linear model, and our linear regression in particular, was appropriate for establishing this line and working with this relationship. I feel relatively comfortable that a linear regression model was appropriate for these data points. Now, let's go and work with our last problem. We've talked about this a bunch before. We already know this is a quadratic, so I think we could safely say, I don't think that a linear model is going to do justice for this quadratic. But let's prove that very quickly. So let's go back over. Let me clear everything out for a second by running a quick check of all my list values. And remember, what did I say? I put it into 4 and 5. So let's run a new linear regression. Stat, calc, linreg a plus bx. And now I'm going to tell it to use my L4 and my L5. As before, I'm going to tell it to take my y value. I'm going to do my vars, y vars function, and make sure that I populate my regression line. And away I go. I'll calculate. We'll get the good thing that we were familiar with before, negative 9.33 plus 7x. We knew that as our equation. There's our good old pretty doggone high correlation coefficient. Now, let's do the same thing. I'm going to show you something interesting when we work this through in a second. But let's do the same thing. Let's populate into L3 in a moment our residuals. So here we go. Stat, edit. Remember, go back to your L3. I'm going to clear it out real quick. Cleared. Go back into it. And now what am I going to do? Second, list. Take my res ID. Hit my good old enter key. And there come my residuals. And we might remember some of those values from before. Okay, next step. Let's just kind of fiddle around on the calculator real quick. Let's do a graph. Dimension mismatch, okay? So let's think about what I might have here. Let's do a quick zoom. Do a zoom stat. And we have a dimension mismatch. So let's think through on the calculator what might be off here. Let's look at my plot. No, I don't have any problem with that. But let's look at what I'm asking my stat plot to do. L1 and an L3. Well, think, why am I not working right now? Well, let's take a look and see. Why am I getting this type of error? I'm getting a dimension mismatch because my L1 has how many entries in it? It's got 12. My L3 only has 6. That's why I'm getting this good old dimension mismatch. So let's think about my plot. Where do I have a little bit of a problem? Well, what do I have for my plot? I'm trying to plot L1 and L3. 12 entries and 6 entries. That ain't going to work. So let's go back over here and let's fix this. Who do I really want? I want my L4. Those should be my real X values here. And L3. And now when I go ahead and run, I will get a graph. I'll get a little bit of a residual piece as well. So let's do one more piece of information here, a little bit more work. Let's do a zoom. A good old zoom stat one more time. And here comes a very interesting, there's a linear regression line. Let's clear that out just so we're just looking at our residual plot real quick. So I'm going to go over to my Y1. I'm just going to go ahead and clear that out. So when I look at my graph, all I see is a residual. And take a look at this residual. Does it look like a parabola? It sure does. And so what am I noticing? My residuals have what? They have a pattern left in them. And when I see something like this, a real distinctive, obvious type of pattern, it's telling me that a linear regression model is not accounting for all of the patterns that happen to exist in these data points. I am still seeing a pattern that exists. My linear model has not accounted for enough, so to speak, of a true pattern. There's some pattern left over. And when I see this, I don't see a random scatter in my residual plot. What that's telling me in this case is that a linear model is not appropriate. So these are the basic pieces that I just want you to be familiar with. Make sure you're good with all the calculator elements. You saw me do a little bit of debugging here as well. Maybe intentional, maybe unintentional, but it's a good feel for, hey, when I see one of these, and particularly if you have a lot of data into your different lists, you can get one of those mismatches very quickly just because you haven't cleared out your past specifications. Now, there's one more thing that I'd like to show you very quick. This is one place where, told you before, we can't really see the residual list. We kind of can't do anything with it, like run one var stats, unless we populate it into one of our list elements. But when it comes to plotting, here's something that's very, very interesting. So let me back out. And I'm going to go back into my plot. And watch what I'm going to do this time. Still have my plot on. On my Y list, I will be able to select my res ID. And I'll still be able to run, and I'll still get the exact same thing. So there's a couple circumstances where you can actually use your res ID. Let me show you one where you can't, as a matter of fact. Sorry to disappoint you, but I might as well let you see all these pieces. Stat, calc, one var stats. I would love to be able to tell my calculator, could you please do this with the res ID? So let me try. Second, list, res ID. That looks lovely. It ought to be able to do it. It populated it brilliantly for me. I ought to be able to just calculate that. Well, look at what my calculator does. It's an error. And again, why? Because for some reason, unbeknownst to me, I didn't write the operating system for this, so sorry about that. That res ID winds up being reserved. So I can't do some of those nice number crunching things that I'd like to do with it. But I can use it in a scatter plot. So just kind of be aware of that. The populate, I just recommend go ahead and throw your data into L3 anyway in case you want to do something with your residuals above and beyond just kind of plot something. If you want to do some numerical analysis, they got to live in a list. If you just need to do some graphing, some plotting or whatever, we have the option that we can kind of go ahead and work this way. So that's about it. You've seen all these different pieces. You've seen all these calculator skills now. Hopefully they're very helpful to you. Remember, we did a little bit extra here. Some of the pieces that you saw, me doing some debugging, so on and so forth, is just some of the vagaries of the calculator every once in a while. We just kind of have to practice, fix some of our own problems. Remember, each time we're working, make sure that we have the right list, so on and so forth. Hopefully this was a pretty useful lesson to you, and it wraps up most of the remaining pieces we're trying to do as we get started in section 3.2 on linear regression.